The interpretation of Aristotle's account of the principles of demonstration in the Greek commentary tradition is significantly different from Aristotle's own account. Whereas Aristotle classifies the principles mainly according to their intrinsic characteristics as propositions, the commentators do so by appealing to the Noah's cognitive attitude towards the principles. In this talk, I explain this difference, showing that it reflects the commentators' adaptation of Aristotle's theory of demonstration to the epistemological theories originated in the Hellenistic era. Before I present the topic in greater detail, a few words about the sources in order. Only two direct interpretations of the first book of the Posterior Analytics, where Aristotle presents his account of the principles of demonstration, have come down to us. Themisius' paraphrase of the Posterior Analytics, it's a commentary from the 4th century CE, and Philoponus' commentary on the first book of this work, dated to the 6th century CE, but we can also learn about the understanding of this account in late antiquity from indirect sources. The most informative among them is Proclus's commentary on the first book of Euclid's Elements, written in the 5th century CE. In all these sources, the epistemological interpretation of Aristotle's account of the principle is taken for granted. Therefore, we have no clear evidence about the rationale behind this interpretation and the considerations that led later antique commentators to accept it as a standard understanding of the principles of demonstration. In view of these difficulties, here I do not offer a comprehensive account of this commentary tradition. Rather, I focus on Philoponus' account and specifically examine his understanding of the distinction between axioms and theses. I first showed that he incorporates Hellenistic epistemology into Aristotle's theory of the principles, and second, that he adapts his theory of the intellect to this interpretation. In the course of my discussion, I appeal to other sources of information about the interpretation of Aristotle's account of the principles in antiquity, thereby placing Philoponus' account in its historical context. I begin with a brief description of the difference between Aristotle's account of the principles and the commentator's interpretation thereof. And the first slide can be shown. In the Posterior Analytics 1-2, Aristotle presents the following classification of the principles of demonstration. An immediate syllogistic principle I call thesis, a premise that one cannot prove, and it is not necessary for anyone who learns something to assume it. And I call axiom, a premise that anyone who learns must assume. Of this, a hypothesis is that which assumes whichever part of a contradiction. I mean, for example, that something is or something is not. And a definition is without this. Here, Aristotle presents a threefold classification of the principles of demonstration in two stages. First, he distinguishes two classes of principles by their scope, saying that axioms are necessary principles for any learning, whereas theses are not. That is, they are principles of specific sciences. Next, divides these two theses into two classes, hypotheses and definitions, saying that the former states that something is or is not, whereas the latter does not. The exact significance of this classification is unclear and controversial, but for understanding the commentator's interpretation of it, it suffices to see that by this account, the axioms are necessary conditions for learning, hence common to all sciences, and that the criterion of distinguishing hypotheses from definitions is a characteristics of these principles as propositions. The difference between this and Philoponus' understanding of the principles becomes clear already in the third page of his commentary on the Posterior Analytics, where he defines the demonstration as follows. Demonstration is a scientific syllogism derived from self-persuasive and agreed propositions. By this definition, the principles of demonstration are characterized not by their scope of application and their propositional characteristics, but by the Noah's cognitive disposition towards them. They are self-persuasive and agreed. This approach finds further another expression in Philoponus' understanding of the principle's status as indemonstrable. Whereas in Aristotle's view, the principles cannot be proved and are immediate premises because there is no prior proposition from which they can be derived. In Philoponus' view, immediate premises do not require demonstration or a middle term. This difference reflects Aristotle's and Philoponus' different viewpoints. Whereas Aristotle explains the indemonstrability of the principles to a characteristic that holds for them as premises, that is, the fact that there is no more universal premise from which they can be proved, Philoponus explains this feature by appealing to the knower's cognitive disposition towards them. That is, whether from the knower's viewpoint, they do or do not call for a proof. This understanding shapes Philoponus's interpretation of Aristotle's classification of the principles of demonstration, as you can see from the following two passages, one from his commentary on posterior analytics 1.2, and another from his commentary on posterior analytics 1.10. Now the next slide can be shown. Since there are different meanings of immediate premise, he draws a distinction and says that of immediate premises, some are theses and others are axioms and common notions. Axioms are those that we know from within ourselves and without demonstration, of which some contribute to every science, as we said, others to several sciences, like those that concern quantity, and yet others to one science. A thesis is also indemonstrable or requires very little persuasion. By being evident, it belongs to the axioms and self-persuasive principles, but by not being evident, strictly speaking, it requires certain instruction. Thus, a thesis differs from an axiom in this respect, but it differs from it also in another respect. Namely, we put forward the axioms or common notions from within ourselves, as has been said, while we take thesis of each science from a teacher. The next slide can be shown. The hypothesis is divided again into two species, of which one is called hypothesis, homonymously with the genus, while the other is a postulate. It is common to every hypothesis that it is not dependent on natural notions, but it is posited by a teacher. But those that are neither clear nor known, though require reasoning, are taken indemonstratively from the teacher and are called postulates. And the next slide, this is the next passage from which we can learn about Philoponus' account of the principle. Of immediate premises, some are self-persuasive and natural to all human beings, in common, and others are not natural to all. Those that are natural to all because they are persuasive from within themselves are called axioms and common notions, while those that are not natural to all but to some are called theses. Further, of hypotheses, though some are true and appear true to the learner, are taken from the expert, whereas others do not appear true to the learner. Those that are assumed and appear true to the learner are called by a special term hypothesis homonymously with the genus, while those that do not appear to the learner are called postulate. And the next slide can be shown. It's a small table that shows the difference between the two accounts. In keeping with this definition of demonstration, here Philoponus characterizes the principles from the viewpoint of the knower's disposition towards them. He holds that we know the axioms from within ourselves, and like Aristotle, who says that they are common to us all sciences, he says that they are common and natural to all human beings. Further, unlike Aristotle, Philoponus qualifies the status of the thesis in comparison to the axioms. Although he regards them as indemonstrable, he says that they are not strictly speaking evident, as the axioms are, and are not natural to all human beings, require a short explanation or instruction, and are received from a teacher. In the same vein, he holds that the hypotheses do not depend on natural notions and are taken from a teacher or an expert, and adds that they are true and appear true, unlike the postulates discussed in posterior analytics 1.10 that are unclear, do not appear to the learner, and require proof. This account is not only different from Aristotle's, it is incompatible with his requirement that the principles of demonstration should be better known by nature and not better known to us. By this requirement, the question whether the knower finds the principles self-persuasive or evident is irrelevant and even misleading. The belief that a certain proposition commands on the knower indicates that it is better known to us. But since Aristotle claims that what is better known to us is not better known by nature, this consideration is unlikely to lead us to the principles of demonstration. This significant departure from Aristotle notwithstanding, Philoponus' understanding of the principles is far from being idiosyncratic. Similar understandings of the principles are widespread in the late antique and earlier sources. For example, in the Hebdomadibus, Philoponus' contemporary Poetius distinguishes principles that are common to all human beings from principles that only learned principles have. Similarly, in his commentary on the first book of Euclid's Elements, Proclus ascribes to Aristotle the distinction of the principles into axioms, hypotheses, and postulates, and characterized them as follows, and it's not in the slide. Axioms are known to the learner and self-persuasive. Hypotheses are not self-persuasive, but are nevertheless considered and posited. And postulates are unknown and are not considered, but nevertheless posited. This approach is not unique to Neoplatonic thinkers. It is found also in Themisius's paraphrase of the Postanalytics, where he says that all human beings have by nature the common notions of all the axioms. The theses are indemonstrable principles that the learner cannot bring forward from within himself, but must take it from a teacher. And that hypotheses do not depend on natural notions, but given by an expert, whereas postulates are neither clear nor known to the learner. Further, a passage from Alexander Vuvodis's commentary on Metaphysics 1.3 suggests that he too understood the difference between axioms and hypotheses in a similar way, by distinguishing principles that one knows from oneself and do not require demonstration from hypotheses. This understanding of the principles of demonstration gives rise to two questions. What considerations underlie this classification, and why do theses differ from the axioms in the way described in these passages? I begin with the first question. An answer to the first question can be inferred from the following passage from the introduction to Philoponus's commentary on the posterior analytics. So now the next slide can be shown. Philosophers needed demonstration as a tool for the correction of the parts of philosophy. I mean the practical and the theoretical. For just as a carpenter distinguishes the straight log from the curved by using a ruler, and just as a builder distinguishes a perpendicular wall from that which leans down by using a plummet, the philosopher distinguishes by means of the demonstrative standard, he says the apodeictico canoni, truth from falsehood in the case of theory and good from evil in the case of practice. From this passage, we can learn about Philoponus's general understanding of Aristotle's theory of demonstration. He does not understand it as a theory of science as it was traditionally understood, nor does he regard it as a theory of understanding as it is commonly held today. He understands it as a theory of knowledge, but still not in the way that modern proponents of this view understand it. That is, he does not see it as a theory of justification, but regards demonstration as a standard, canon, that serves as a means of discerning truth from falsehood in theoretical knowledge and good from evil in practical knowledge. This understanding of demonstration and the use of the word canon, which is the title of Epicurus's lost treatise on epistemology, also called On the Criterion, suggests that Philoponus presents to his reader the posterior analytics as the treatise where Aristotle addresses, through his theory of demonstration, the epistemological question of the criteria of truth formulated by the Epicureans and the Stoics in the Hellenistic era. Viewed in this slide, in the above account of the principles of demonstration, Philoponus continues this line of interpretation. He does not call the axioms common and natural notions as he not only calls the axioms common and natural notions as the Stoics call one of the criteria of truth, but understanding in the way that the Stoics understand their common notions. He regards them as evident and holds that they are common to all human beings. Key terms from Hellenistic epistemologies appear quite often in Philoponus's commentary on the posterior analytics, but I did not find in this commentary a discussion where elements from this epistemology are consciously and explicitly read into Aristotle's theory. I did, however, find this line of interpretation in Philoponus's commentary on Aristotle's Physics 2.1, where he understands Aristotle's argument in the posterior analytics 1.3 that there are principles of demonstration and therefore not everything is demonstrable as follows. And this is the next slide in the presentation. There is no need to prove evident things, nor generally to seek demonstration of everything except of doubtful matters. For as he, namely Aristotle, himself proves in the posterior analytics, it is impossible that there is demonstration of everything. For if there is a demonstration of everything, there would not be a demonstration of anything, because we will be led to infinity in our eagerness to prove the principles from which we prove. Therefore, one should not seek a demonstration of everything, for there are many propositions that surpass all demonstrations and yield conviction from the evident. And a person who wishes to provide demonstrations of such things provides an indication of his being deprived of the criterion of reason, because he is incapable of distinguishing what is less clear and what is clearer, and what has conviction from within and what does not have it from within, and has demonstrations from other principles. For it is necessary that such a man proves clear things from unclear things. This interpretation of the Epistemologies 1-3 calls to mind the Stoic notion of sign inferences, that is, inferences that proceed from evident and clear premises to non-evident or unclear conclusions. In keeping with this notion, Philoponus restricts the scope of demonstrable things to doubtful or controversial matters, and regards as a mark of the principles of demonstration their being evident. Further, like in his account of the principles of demonstration, here if the factor that distinguishes the indemonstrable propositions from demonstrable propositions is cognitive or epistemic, that is, the knowledge criterion of reason that facilitates judgment as to whether certain propositions are clear or unclear, self-persuasive, or require demonstration. In the same vein, he clarifies the sense in which, in his view, the principles are indemonstrable. Rather than saying, as Aristotle does, that the principles cannot be proved, he says that the principles do not require demonstration, and that proving them is methodologically flawed, since such demonstrations are bound to proceed from positions that are less clear than the conclusion that they establish. So understood, this passage suggests that in interpreting Aristotle's account of the principles of demonstration, Philoponus and plausibly other commentators continue a tradition of earlier attempts to offer Aristotelian and Platonic answers to the question of the criteria of truth raised in the Hellenistic era. The history of this tradition is yet to be told, but my non-comprehensive survey of the sources reveals two stages relevant to the present discussion. The first is found in sources that ascribe to Aristotle or regard as Platonic the view that the two cognitive faculties, the intellect and perception, are evident criteria of truth. This view is reported by Sextus Empiricus in the following passage, and version of it is found in Arius Didymus, in Ptolemy, and in Alcinous. So it's widespread. And now the next slide, where the passage from Sextus Empiricus appears, can be shown. The followers of Aristotle and Theophrastus and the Peripatetics in general, seeing that the nature of things is at its highest level double, since, as I said above, some things are perceptible and others are intelligible, they too admit a double criterion, perception for perceptibles and intellect for intelligibles, and common to both, as Theophrastus says, is the evidence. First in order is the irrational and indemonstrable criterion, perception, but the intellect is first in power, even if it seems secondary in order as compared to perception. From what has been said then, it appears that the first criteria of knowing things are perception and intellect, the former having the role of an instrument and the other that of a craftsman. For just as we cannot examine the heavy and light without a scale, or differentiate straight from crooked things without a ruler, so the intellect naturally does not approve things without perception. In the second stage of this development, the intellect is regarded not only as the faculty that judges what is true and what is false, but in keeping with the Epistemologies 2:19, it is viewed also as a faculty that grasps the principles of demonstration. The main evidence that I found for this stage is from Galen's writing. For example, in the following passage from his therapeutic method, he explicitly relates the above theory of the double criterion with the apprehension of the indemonstrable principles, and gives as an example the Euclidean common notion that Aristotle and the commentator presents in exemplifying the axioms. If equals are subtracted from equals, the reminders are equal. And the passage from Galen is in the next slide. And the next slide, please. Yes. The ancient philosophers said that the genus of apparent things is twofold. One which is admitted also by the empiricists belongs to things that are judged by a certain perception, for example, white, black, hard, soft, hot, and cold, while the other belongs to things that are observed by the intellect according to first indemonstrable apprehension. For example, things that are equal to the same things are also equal to one another. If equals are added to equals, the wholes are equals, and if equals are subtracted from equals, the remainder are equals. The exact role of this tradition in shaping the above interpretation of Aristotle's account of the principle of demonstration cannot be determined beyond doubt. But considering the other evidence, it plausibly explains the origin of these interpretations. Moreover, this explanation gains support from the fact that it provides a straightforward answer to the second question that I raised at the beginning of my talk. Why do the commentators qualify the status of the thesis and claim that they cannot be attained without a teacher? These theories of the criteria of truth were designed to secure the very possibility of knowledge against skeptical challenges, and therefore sought to find infallible criteria of knowledge. The account of the common notions found in these theories serve this purpose. As Michael Frede explains, common notions are criteria of truth because of the way by which they are formed. They are not notions that we form according to our beliefs, viewpoints, or needs, but we have them because our natural constitution is such that unless our faculties are impaired, we necessarily form these and not other notions. For this reason, these notions are called common and natural. That is because all human beings have them by nature. Applied to Aristotle's account of the principles of demonstration, this conception of the common notions entails the distinction between the axioms and the theses that we found in Philoponus and the other commentators. Being preconditions for any learning and being used in all sciences, the axiom can more easily be understood as common and natural to all human beings. The theses, by contrast, being principles of specific branches of knowledge, are clearly not common to all human beings. They are technical principles that are not formed by nature. Therefore, we do not know them from ourselves, but take them from a teacher. Further, a further examination of our sources shows that at least two commentators, Alexander of Aphrodiseus and Philoponus, are aware of this consequence of the incorporation of the Hellenistic conception of common notions into Aristotle's philosophy, and that in their theories of the intellect, they attempt to explain how this faculty grasps not only the principles of the sciences, as is the case in Aristotle, but also the common notions shared by all human beings. In the discussion of the theoretical intellect on the soul, Alexander divides the intellect that we have by birth, called potential intellect, into two intellects. One, the material and natural intellect that all human beings have, and the second is he calls it the acquired intellect, which serves as the form of the material intellect and found only in those who practice and learn, and I quote, in the manner appropriate to the sciences, because their acquisition is no longer by nature. However, a few sentences later, he reconsiders this view and presents the possibility that all human beings have, to a certain extent, a share in the acquired and formal intellect. And this is the next slide. In the case of knowledge and the intellect, the capacities are by nature, but the states and activities are no longer by nature. For this reason, we say that not everyone has this intellect, but describe only the skillful men as having this intellect. Alternatively, anyone who is not impaired has also a share in this intellect up to a point, being led by nature itself to the comprehension of the universal and knowledge of things by composition. And this is more properly called common intellect. Here, Alexander presents a third type of intellect, common intellect, in addressing a problem that arises from his distinction between the potential natural intellect and the actual acquired intellect, which leaves no room for the intermediate state of a rational layman who are capable of forming universal concepts and formulating sentences, but have no technical and scientific knowledge. his solution invokes the account of the common notions of the Hellenistic thinkers. Although he begins by saying that all human beings have a share in the acquired intellect up to a point, he does not argue that the content of the common intellect is attained by learning, a skillful individual attain scientific concepts, but says that nature itself leads human beings to the comprehension of universal concepts. So understood, in this passage, Alexander presents a theory of the intellect that takes into account the above Aristotelian epistemologies that regard the intellect as a criterion of truth that grasps the common notions that all human beings share. The distinction he draws between the common intellect and the acquired intellect corresponds to the distinction between the axioms, or the common notions, and theses that we found in Philoponus. But here Alexander does not explicitly relate this distinction to the principles of demonstration and their acquisition. An explicit link between a similar theory of the intellect and the principles of demonstration is found in Philoponus, in his, most precisely in his commentary on Aristotle's On the Soul. At the beginning of his introduction to this commentary, Philoponus describes the intellect as the capacity that apprehends the intelligible objects in a manner that surpasses demonstration. And like Alexander, he says, and I quote, the activity of this intellect comes to be only in those who have reached the summit of purity and knowledge. However, like Alexander, it tries to avoid the consequences of this restrictive account of the intellect and explains how those who have not reached the state of purity and knowledge acquire their basic knowledge by the intellect. In this context, he refers to the Postanalytics 1.3 and explicitly mentions the common notions as principles of demonstration. And this is the next slide in the presentation. In discursive reason, if discursive reason syllogizes at times also about intelligibles, it does so not by itself, but when it combines it with the intellect, just as it syllogizes about perceptibles when it combines with the imagination. Even if we, the many, do not participate in this intellect, certain traces and mental images have come down to us, to us. And these are the common notions which we all know undemonstratively and much better than by demonstration. For example, the things that are equal to the same things are equal to one another. And whereas equals are, whenever equals are subtracted from equals, the remainder become equal. And either the affirmation or the negation holds for in every case. And all things desire the good, and others of this kind. For we do not need reasoning for their persuasiveness, but we know them by simple apprehension better than by demonstration. As we said, these common notions that permeate through everything are evidently images of the intellect. About this, Aristotle said also in the Postanalytics in reply to those who believe that there is no science, and he quotes Aristotle, we said that there is not only science, but a principle of science by which we know the terms, namely the terms of the syllogism. Here, Philoponus addresses Alexander's problem and explicitly refers to the intellect as the mental capacity that grasps the principles of demonstration as he understands them in his commentaries, on the commentaries on the Postanalytics and the physics, namely as common notions shared by all human beings. In so doing, he argues in a Neoplatonic way that in addition to the intellect, strictly speaking, by which the few knowledgeable people apprehend the intelligible objects, there are traces of this intellect by which the common notions are grasped by all human beings, and to which Aristotle refers in the Postanalytics 1.3. From this consideration, we can reasonably infer that the accounts of the principles of demonstration found in Philoponus and in the other commentators reflect an attempt to epistemologize Aristotle's theory of demonstration by incorporating into this theory the conception of common notions as criteria of truth. This conclusion explains the difference between Aristotle's and the commentators' understanding of the principles and clarifies two related aspects of the commentators' account of the principles of demonstration. One, the understanding of the distinction between the axiom and thesis as a distinction between principles that are naturally grasped by all human beings and principles whose apprehension requires teaching. And The second point is that the theories of the intellect propounded by Alexander and Philoponus. The former aspect requires a distinction between common and technical principles, which call in turn for a distinction between the intellectual capacities of Guzman, the common and acquired intellects in Alexander's view, and the intellect and its traces in Philoponus' view. In this view, the above examination brought to light the influence of Hellenistic epistemology on the commentary tradition on the psychoanalytics and its consequences for the commentators' understanding of the intellect. So thank you very much for your attention.